This is the second lecture for Wednesday, April 1st, Community Ecology, continuing on with this idea of diversity within communities. There's different types of communities that have different levels of diversity. We've looked at a number of different factors that shape diversity, that explain diversity, either explain the diversity that you observe if you go out and look at different communities and compare them, or that explain changes that take place within a certain community. Those are two different things, really. That if you're looking at a single community and how diversity changes over time, or whether you're looking at diversities in the Arctic versus diversity in a coral reef, and explaining or trying to explain why one is very diverse in terms of the different number of species and different number of niches that are occupied, the different ways that they compete, their different sources of food or energy, and explain why they're different in different locations. Well, next, let's look at patterns of species diversity that you find around the world, and we'll look at a couple of different aspects of this. There's some communities that are highly diverse, or in other words, they've got a lot of different species. These species have a lot of different roles. There's a lot of different habitats to be occupied. Or in terms of this idea of community ecology in the first place, looking back at this all the way to this idea of niche. There's a lot of niches that are filled by a lot of different species. Other communities, not so diverse. Islands, even though islands tend to have a relatively low species diversity in relation to some other locations, some other communities, islands are a very good way to look at what kind of things result in one island being highly diverse and another island not being so diverse. It's a good, they're this kind of a unique system in terms of community diversity. But because some islands are very diverse and other islands are not very diverse, it's a good way to look at the kind of factors that influence species diversity or community diversity. And then finally, we'll look at biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity, and why there's so much of an emphasis on biodiversity, and why people are not going to McDonald's because the beef comes from Brazil, where they're cutting down the rainforest, the tropical rainforest, to raise cattle, or why people are not using styrofoam cups because of pollution, the effects on community diversity. We'll look at some of those. So to begin with, this idea, think about it. There's some communities around the world that have a high species diversity. There are a lot of species that make their living a lot of different ways, that occupy a lot of different habitats, or in other words, there's some communities that have a lot of niches that are filled by a lot of species. Tropical rainforests, coral reefs, there's other places, some swamps and very productive areas have a lot of species in them, whereas other ones, not very diverse. So we've looked at some of these already in terms of latitude. If you move north from the equator or south from the equator, then you start to get into areas where there's not as much rainfall, there's not as much primary productivity, not as much sunlight, so there's basically not as much energy. We looked at some of those. Latitude, rainfall, elevation, and we looked at the complexity of the habitat, whether you have three-dimensional habitat. So we've looked at some of these. But if we turn our attention to some other factors, some other explanations of why some communities are very diverse and others aren't, then we can look at 5 different thoughts, 5 different ideas or factors that together or separately sometimes contribute to diversity among communities. So we'll look at these 5 different factors, and we'll see that if you think about one particular community, like the woods that are across the street from the CBLS or Chaffee, a little ways away, there's a community, a woodland community, and it's got a certain level of community diversity or species diversity. And if you compare that to the coral reef or a tropical rainforest, or if you compare that to the tundra, each one of those communities has different characteristics in terms of these 5 different factors. Each one of those communities has different levels of species diversity or community diversity. So let's look at these 5. First of all, there's structural heterogeneity, or in other words, how many different habitats are there, how many different niches are there in terms of habitat that can be filled by different species. If you've got this, if you look on the figure here, this grassland, with your van driving through the grassland, you can see it's flat. Maybe this grass is 6 or 7 inches high. That's not a very three-dimensional habitat that can be occupied by different species. If you contrast that with this lush, temperate rainforest on the right, where there's ferns and there's trees and there's mosses, there's a stream, there's all these different opportunities that organisms can take advantage of. So if you're just looking at the number of species and community diversity, of course you'd expect the ecosystem, the community on the right, to be a lot more diverse than the community on the left, to have a lot more species, because there's a lot more opportunities. The structural heterogeneity of the community on the right is much greater than that of the left. And there's all kinds of different communities. If you just chose one of those communities that I was talking about before, the forest across the street from you or I, or a tropical rainforest versus the tundra, different levels of structural heterogeneity. There's also 2 temporal components in terms of what might explain or what might be related to how diverse a community is. How many different species there are, how many different niches are filled, that have to do with time, these temporal components. One of those is ecological time. So communities, as you know, hopefully, are a group of populations that are interacting with one another. Species are interacting. Competition, predator-prey, symbiotic interactions, all those different things are taking place. So the amount of time that's gone on for a community to develop, and this goes into that when we're looking at equilibrium and non-equilibrium models explaining community structure, the amount of time that's gone on, especially in undisturbed conditions, it has an influence on how diverse a community is. If species have been interacting for a long time, then on one hand you might have a climax community, you might have a reduced number of species interaction. On the other hand, though, a long-term stable community with a lot of different niches that have been established over time, a lot of different participants in this community, then a lot of places you're going to find that stability of habitat and the fact that these ecological relationships have been going on for a long time is related to species diversity compared to other places where the community hasn't been established for very long. All the members of a community haven't arrived, and these interactions haven't resulted in niche partitioning. So there's ecological time. There's also evolutionary time, where organisms are evolving over time in relation to environmental conditions and in relation to interactions that they're taking place, that they're taking part in. So if you look at how long species have been interacting and species have been influenced, there's been selective forces acting upon species in a community, then the more time that they've been selected for, certain traits are selected for, certain traits are selected against, then that kind of long-term evolution, that an organism is responding to a certain community over a long period of time, those conditions will lead to more diverse communities, more species, more niches filled than other places where there's disturbance and organisms haven't had such a chance to respond to both physical and biological features of their communities. They're not selected upon as long. So both ecological time and evolutionary time. Now here's a couple that are related to stability of a community and the amount of energy in a community as well. That one is climatic stability, how much energy there is from the sun, how much water there is, what kind of harsh conditions, storms and freezes and things like that are eliminating species from a community. Well, the more stable a community is over time, then the more opportunity there is for species to become adapted to that community. So it ties in with evolutionary time, but in this case it has to do with the climate that's influenced them, not the multitude of factors that can have results on the evolution of different species, but how stable is the climate? And this relates to the latitude that we looked at earlier, that if you look at the tropics, there's less seasonal fluctuation, there's fewer changes that are going to result in some species being eliminated. And along with that is this fifth factor, primary productivity, basically the amount of energy. Sunlight, water, nutrients, closer to the equator, warmer areas, more sunlight, less seasonal fluctuation. Basically, the more energy there is, the more organisms can be supported. The more energy there is, the more diverse communities tend to be. So when you have these close to the equator with a lot of water, a lot of rainfall on land, or just warmer water in the ocean, those tend to be very productive and also some of the most diverse communities on Earth in the tropical rainforests and in coral reefs. So those are some of the explanations why some communities are more diverse than others. If you look at one community and you take into consideration what the primary productivity is, what the stability of the climate is, how long this community has been there, how long the members of that community have been evolving in relation to one another, then those kind of things can explain or go a long ways towards explaining why one community is very diverse and another one isn't. Well, let's look at islands in terms of community diversity. Islands, as I mentioned before, they tend to be relatively low in terms of diversity, species diversity or community diversity. There's a lot of species that are only found in this one island. They have a limited distribution. At the end of this section, we're going to look at different members of communities, and we're going to see there's endemic species. Endemic species are found in one location and nowhere else. So, for instance, in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, there's a lot of species that are only found in Hawaii and nowhere else in the world. Those are endemic species, and those are quite common on islands. They're isolated. They've got certain conditions that lead to speciation, development of species that are only found there and nowhere else. So one of the things about islands, though, there's a lot of different islands, different ages and different locations. Islands are a good way to look at what influences community diversity. There's different islands with different communities with different levels of diversity, some very diverse and some not very diverse. And ultimately, we'll go back and look at this idea of equilibrium and the equilibrium models for explaining community diversity. but in this case, specific to islands. So if you think about the diversity, species diversity, or community diversity on an island, what explains species diversity on an island? Well, one factor is the rate at which new species arrive at the island, and that's balanced by the rate at which species become extinct on the island. So you've got these new species showing up at a certain rate. You've got new species that evolve at a certain rate, and then these species are going extinct at the same time. So you can imagine that if the rate at which new species are arriving or evolving, if that's high and the rate of extinction is low, then the community diversity on an island is going to be increasing. And if the rate of extinction is high and the rate of new species coming in or evolving is low, then that community is probably not going to be nearly as diverse because it's losing species rather than gaining species. So we'll look at this idea of species equilibrium in relation to islands, specifically related to islands. So here's this equilibrium that I was talking about before. If you can pause this and look at the words that are in this, the lines that are in these figures down below. And so this immigration in the yellowish line, if it's high, then you've got a pretty high, you tend to have a high species diversity. But the immigration rate increases. As the extinction rate increases, then you tend to have a lower level of species diversity. So extinction on the right going up, you tend to have low species diversity. Immigration, arrival of new species especially, you have a lower rate. So you've got new species coming in, you've got species that are there going extinct for whatever reason. They arrive and they don't make it, or they've been there for a while and they eventually go extinct as conditions change. But that's the situation that you have. The number of species that you find on any particular island, whether you're talking about a little island or a big island, if you went there and looked at the number of species that are there, then you'd find there's a certain number of species. That's the equilibrium number. It's the balance of new arrivals and extinctions. That's the figure on the left. Now, what we're going to do is you could look at a whole bunch of different islands, but for the sake of our coverage of this, we're going to look at a small island and a big island. On this small island, that blue arrow that's going down to the x-axis is the equilibrium number of species. Of course, this is changing over time. But what you tend to find on small islands compared to big islands is that there's fewer species, lower species diversity on small islands than big islands. And if you first relate this in terms of immigration and extinction, then you see the immigration and extinction intersection for the small islands is to the left, and the result is you've got a smaller equilibrium number for small islands. You've got lower diversity. For big island, you've got a higher diversity. So you can pause and look at where those intersect and see where the blue arrows go down to the x-axis if you want to. But there's a simple explanation for this, and that is basically a combination of two things. The balance, remember, is immigration, new species, and extinction, removal of species. And there's two main factors related to the explanation for this. One is the size of the island, and one is the distance from the island, or the distance of the island from the mainland, where these species that are immigrating, they're coming from mainland. Might be Asia, might be South America, might be North America, but somewhere these species that are immigrating, they're derived from some continent, or it could be another island. So these black arrows are species that are moving around. They're dispersing. They're migrating. They're being blown off course by storms. Whatever. There's an insect. There's a bird. There's a plant that's rafting around in the water. If you've got a big island close to the mainland, close to South America, for instance, look at all those arrows that intersect this big green island. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 species that could show up to this large island. So the immigration rate for this large island close to the mainland is pretty high. The immigration rate for the small island far from the mainland, look, there's only 1 species that shows up, 1 out of the 7 species that are moving around, that are migrating or dispersing. There's only 1 of them that makes it out there. It's a long ways, and it's a small target in the first place. So if you looked at the diversity, species diversity of that big green island versus the little green island, and of course you'd expect species diversity, the community, to be a lot more diverse on the big island that's close to the mainland than the small island. There's thousands and thousands of islands out there that all have their own characteristic species diversity or community diversity. And they all have different levels of size. They're all different sizes. And they're all different distances from the source of these species that are immigrating. So this is a thought in terms of what explains the community diversity that you find amongst all these different islands that are out there. Well, the next thing that we'll look at will be for Friday. We'll look at biodiversity and community function. As I said, there's a lot of emphasis on biodiversity, maintaining biodiversity. Just why is that?